The Catcher in the Rye, Chapter 1, a 30-minute read-along. So before we start reading this novel, we need to know just a couple things. We need to know that J.D. Salinger only wrote this novel. This is the only novel he's ever written. He published it in 1951. It has lots of autobiographical details about Salinger's life. So there's a lot in here that, although it's a fictional story, there's a lot in here we can infer that it's probably inspired by true events. Salinger stayed in a hospital in Germany for mental health issues. He did fight in World War II. So a lot of people think this had to do with post-traumatic stress disorder. When this was first published in 1951, this was really, really offensive. Okay, so this was like a very offensive, controversial book for 1951. Even today, some people read it and they think, oh, this is pretty not great. This is pretty offensive, right? So it's been banned in a lot of schools, actually. So going into reading this, I always feel a little nervous reading with students, thinking like this is a book that might be a little offensive. But at the same time, I know it's also a book that's very rewarding and very engaging. So I really enjoyed this book. So I think you guys are going to enjoy this a lot. This novel is told from the perspective of Holden, who's a teenager at a fancy prep school. So we're going to hop right in here. We're going to stop a few times to think about what's going through our head as we read this. Why don't we start with something? So right now I'm thinking a lot about, I just threw out information there. This is an offensive book about mental health. So what does that make you think of? What's a story that you know? This could be TV, this could be movies, this could be comic book, could be another book you read. But what are you thinking about now that might be like this book? Something that either a lot of people found pretty offensive and wanted to ban, or something that was about just mental health in general. So what's going through my mind right now is I'm actually thinking about when I was in middle school and high school, Eminem was really big. So that was a singer or a rapper who there were like a lot of parents who really hated this guy. A lot of teachers really didn't like him. They would like protest. There were like protests on TV about not letting kids listen to Eminem, which all the kids then passed around CDs at school. So that's what I'm thinking about here going into this. Something that's pretty offensive, but became pretty popular amongst teenagers and really all people. All right, so let's get started. This is chapter 1. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born, what my lousy childhood was like, and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I really don't feel like going into it, if you want to know the truth. In the first place, that stuff bores me. And in the second place, my parents would have about 2 hemorrhages apiece if I told you anything pretty personal about them. They're quite touchy about that, especially my father. They're nice and all, I'm just saying that. But I'm not just saying that. But they're also touchy as hell. Besides, I'm not going to tell you my whole goddamn autobiography or anything. I'll just tell you about this madman stuff that happened to me around last Christmas, just before I got pretty run down and had to come back here and take it easy. I mean, that's all I told DB about. And he's my brother and all. He's in Hollywood. That isn't too far from this crummy place. And he comes over and visits me practically every weekend. He's going to drive me home when I come home next month, maybe. He just got a Jaguar, one of those little English jobs that you can go around 200 miles per hour. Cost him damn near $4,000. He's got a lot of dough now. He didn't used to. He used to just be a regular writer when he was home. He wrote this terrific book of short stories called The Secret Goldfish, in case you never heard of him. The best one in it was The Secret Goldfish. It was about this little kid that wouldn't let anybody look at his goldfish because he bought it with his own money, and it killed me. Now he's out in Hollywood, DB, being a prostitute. If there's one thing I hate, it's the movies. Don't even mention them to me. All right, so we're getting a strong voice here from Holden. Holden's this teenager who's writing to us. We know a few facts about him that are kind of helping us understand what type of guy this is, right? We know that he doesn't want to tell you about his childhood. He said he had a lousy childhood, doesn't want to talk about it because his parents would have a hemorrhage if he told you about his childhood. Parents don't want him to talk about his childhood. Okay. We also know he doesn't want to tell us much other than this madman stuff So he's going to tell us in this book this madman stuff that happened to him last Christmas. And he had to come down here, wherever here is, and take it easy. So he's writing the book from somewhere after all this madman stuff happened. He's not going to tell us about his childhood. He's just going to tell us about that madman stuff. And then we also know here that he's got a brother who's really successful, who's a writer, but he thinks that he's being a prostitute, right? And by that, he means he thinks he's sold out. So he's saying, like, my brother was this great writer, but now he's making movies. He's writing for the movies, and he's such a sellout because I hate movies. Okay, so what I'd like you to think of is, like, what type of guy do you think this is? Okay, do you have someone in your life that you're starting to think of, like, this might be this type of person, or maybe a character that you know from, again, TV movies, or just like somebody you know of from online? But who are you kind of thinking of at this point? Holden might be kind of like that guy. Where I want to start telling is the day I left Pensy Prep. Pensy Prep is this school in Hagerstown, Pennsylvania. You probably heard of it. You've probably seen the ads anyway. They advertise in about 1,000 magazines, always showing some hotshot guy on a horse jumping over a fence. Like as if all you ever did at Pensy was play polo all the time. I never even once saw a horse anywhere near the place. And underneath the guy on the horse picture, it always says, since 1888, we have been molding boys into splendid, clear-thinking young men, strictly for the birds. They don't do a damn more molding at Pensy than they do at any other school. And if I didn't know anybody there that was splendid and clear-thinking at all, maybe 2 guys, if that many. And they probably came to Pensy that way. Anyway, it was the Saturday of the football game with Saxon Hall. The game with Saxon Hall was supposed to be a very big deal around Pensy. It was the last game of the year, and you were supposed to commit suicide or something if old Pensy didn't win. I remember around 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was standing way the hell up on the top of Thompson Hill, right next to this crazy cannon that was in the Revolutionary War and all. You could see the whole field from there, and you could see the 2 teams bashing each other all over the place. You couldn't see the grandstand too hot, but you could hear them all yelling, deep and terrific on the Pensy side, because practically the whole school except me was there, and scrawny and faggy on the Saxon side, because the visiting team hardly ever brought many people with them. All right, so I'm starting to feel a little nervous reading this book out loud, seeing the type of words that are here. So I might start skipping over some profanity here. Particularly this word, I don't like to see this word. So I might skip over this one the next time I see it. But we can start to get a sense of like why this book was seen as pretty offensive and controversial sometimes. We also might see what type of guy Holden is, from the language that he uses. But anyway, I'm visualizing here. I'm picturing in my mind Holden. He's at this game, right? It's a very big deal. It's the last game. It's a football game. I'm imagining him. He's sitting up there. He's kind of far away from them, but he's watching. And that's where he's going to start his story. So we're visualizing here this fancy school. The football game's happening. He's pretty far away. He can't see much, but he's there, just kind of watching over it. And he says, there were never many girls at all at the football games. Only seniors were allowed to bring girls with them. It was a terrible school, no matter how you looked at it. I like to be somewhere at least where you can see a few girls every once in a while, even if they're only scratching their arms or blowing their noses or even just giggling or something. Old Selma Thurmer, she was the headmaster's daughter, showed up at the games quite often, but she wasn't exactly the type that drove you mad with desire. She was a pretty nice girl, though. I sat next to her once in the bus from Hagerstown. We sort of struck up a conversation. I liked her. She had a big nose, and her nails were all bitten down and bleedy looking. She even had those damn falsies that point all over the place. But you felt sort of sorry for her. What I liked about her, she didn't give you a lot of horse manure about what a great guy her dad was. She probably knew what a phony slob he was. All right, so here Holden introduces another character, old Selma Thurmer. What do you think about Holden's description of her? All right, so what does his description of you tell you about Selma, and what does it tell you about Holden? By that, I mean, like, you can describe someone any way you want, right? You can focus on whatever you want to focus on when you talk about someone. So what does it tell you about Holden that he's focusing on? He said she doesn't drive you mad with desire. He likes her. She's got a big nose and she bites her fingernails a lot. And, she doesn't tell you that her dad is great. To me personally, reading that, I'm thinking that Holden might focus a lot on people's looks, people's appearances, how they look. But I'll continue here. And that, again, that's my personal opinion. I'm thinking like I wouldn't focus that much on someone's looks, describing them. I probably wouldn't focus on telling you they had a big nose, right? I would be more polite than that. So the reason I was standing way up on Thompson Hill instead of down at the game was because I gotten back from New York with the fencing team. I was the goddamn manager of the fencing team. And a real quick aside here, this is what fencing is, okay? So fencing is this fancy sword fighting you might see sometimes in the movies or if you watch the Olympics. But this is not a sport everyone plays, right? This is not every school has a fencing team. So I'm thinking like, oh, this is a pretty fancy school. It's got a fencing team on it. All right, but he's the manager of the fencing team. He says, very big deal. We'd gone into New York that morning for this fencing meet at McBurney School, only we didn't have the meet. I left all the foils and equipment and stuff on the goddamn subway. And the foils are what they call the swords. All right, so he's saying he left the swords on the subway. But it wasn't my fault. I had to keep getting up to look at the map so we'd know where to get off. So we got back to Penn around 2:30 instead of around dinner time. The whole team ostracized me the whole way back on the train. It was pretty funny in a way. Ostracize is a really good word. He says the whole team ostracized me the whole way back. What do you think that means to ostracize someone? If you've never heard it, just take a guess. This is not a right or wrong question. And if you have, tell me maybe what does it mean to be ostracized or if you've been ostracized before. But the other reason I wasn't down at the game was because I was on my way to say goodbye to old Spencer, my history teacher. He had the gripe, which is an old-timey disease, but he had the gripe. And I figured I probably wouldn't see him again till Christmas vacation started. He wrote me this note saying he wanted to see me before I went home. He knew I was coming back to Penn, or I wasn't coming back to Penn. So this teacher wants to see him because he's not going to come back. So I'm wondering what is he want to say to him? I forgot to tell you about that. They kicked me out. I wasn't supposed to come back after Christmas vacation on account of I was flunking 4 subjects and not applying myself at all. They gave me frequent warnings to start applying myself, especially around midterms when my parents came up for a conference with old Dermer. But I didn't do it. So I got the X. They give guys the X quite frequently here at Penn. There's a very good academic rating, Penn. It really does. Anyway, it was December and all, and it was cold as a witch's teat, especially on the top of that stupid hill. I only had on my reversible and no gloves or anything. The week before that, somebody's stolen my camel hair coat right out of my room, with my fur-lined gloves right in the pocket and all. Penn was full of crooks. Quite a few guys came from these very wealthy families, but it was full of crooks anyway. More expensive a school is, the more crooks it has. I'm not kidding. Anyway, kept standing next to that crazy cannon, looking down at the game, freezing my ass off. Only I wasn't watching the game too much. What I was really hanging around for, I was trying to feel some kind of goodbye. I mean, I've left schools and places I didn't even know I was leaving. I hate that. I don't care if it's a sad goodbye or a bad goodbye. When I leave a place, I like to know I'm leaving it. And if you don't, you feel even worse. All right, so this jumps out to me as really interesting, right? This is where Holden is saying something he believes in. He's given us some rule that he lives by. He says he doesn't care if it's a sad goodbye or a bad goodbye, but he needs a goodbye, right? He can't have something just disappear from him. He can't just leave a place without knowing he's leaving it. So I'm wondering, has that ever happened to you? Or like, what does that make you think of when you think about goodbyes? So I'm thinking, have you ever left a place not knowing that you were leaving it? Or have you ever lost something not knowing you were going to lose it? Or has someone left your life and you didn't know that was going to happen? It was a surprise. And would you be willing to share, what that was like or what it was? So, and then do you agree with him? Would you want to know something's leaving or that it's going away? Or, is it good to know ahead of time so you can have that goodbye? And why is that even important? Why is a goodbye important? So a lot of thoughts there connecting your own life, but I'd really like to hear, what this makes you think about and thinking about goodbyes and thinking about getting to say goodbye and then getting to think about like surprises that sometimes things leave and you don't know they're going to leave or vice versa, right? So he says, I was lucky. All of a sudden, I thought of something that helped make me know I was getting the hell out. I suddenly remember this time in around October that I and Robert Titchener and Paul Campbell were chucking a football around in front of the academic building. They were nice guys, especially Titchener. It was just before dinner and it was getting pretty dark out, but we kept chucking the ball around anyway. It kept getting darker and darker. We could hardly see the ball anymore, but we didn't want to stop doing what we were doing. So finally we had to. This teacher that taught biology, Mr. Zambesi, stuck his head out of this window in the academic building and told us to go back to our dorm and get ready for dinner. If I get the chance to remember that kind of stuff, I can get a goodbye when I need one. At least most of the time. As soon as I got it, I turned around and started running down the other side of the hill toward old Spencer's house. He didn't live on campus. He lived on Anthony Wayne Avenue. Huh. So here, I've read this before, but reading it this time, I'm like interacting with it in a different way. And here I'm feeling confused. I'm like, why does that moment give him a goodbye? So he says he's playing football or throwing the football around with Robert Titchener and Paul Campbell, his friends. And a teacher says, hey, you got to stop playing. Go wash up for dinner. And he remembers that and thinks about it and is like, okay, I can leave school now. I got a good goodbye. What does that mean? Why does that let him leave and feel like he has a goodbye now? So can you explain it to me for real? I'm not sure why that gives him a goodbye. I ran all the way to the main gate. And then I waited a second till I got my breath. I have no wind, if you want to know the truth. I'm quite a heavy smoker, for one thing. That is, I used to be. They made me cut it out. Another thing, I grew 6.5 inches last year. That's also how I practically got TB and came out here for all these goddamn checkups and stuff. I'm pretty healthy, though. So reading it again out loud this time, I'm thinking about, again, I told you I'm feeling nervous about this book. We're going to see some substance use in this book, all right? So Holden is not a great role model, I'm going to say right off the bat, is what I'm thinking about here. And that's a little more apparent reading it out loud for this read aloud. So he says, anyway, as soon as I got my breath back, I ran across Route 204. It was icy as hell. I damn near fell down. I don't even know what I was running for. I guess I just felt like it. After I got across the road, I felt like I was sort of disappearing. It was this kind of crazy afternoon, terribly cold, and no sun out or anything. And you felt like you were disappearing every time you crossed the road. Boy, I rang the doorbell fast when I got to old Spencer's house. I was really frozen. My ears were hurting, and I could hardly move my fingers at all. Come on, I said out loud almost. Somebody open the door. Finally, old Mrs. Spencer opened it. They didn't have a maid or anything, and they always opened the door themselves. They didn't have too much dough. Holden, Mrs. Spencer said, how lovely to see you. Come in, dear. Are you frozen to death? I think she was glad to see me. She liked me. At least, I think she did. Boy, did I get in that house fast. How are you, Mrs. Spencer? I said, how's Mr. Spencer? Oh, let me take your coat, dear, she said. She didn't hear me ask how Mr. Spencer was. She was sort of deaf. She hung my coat in the hall closet, and I sort of brushed my hair back with my hand. At this point, I'm picturing the house. I'm visualizing it. So I've got this picture of what Mrs. Spencer looks like. And, I know they're in a fancy neighborhood, but their house they don't have much dough. So I'm trying to picture what that might be like. And then I'm picturing, they're getting out of the cold. So he's all bundled up and it's snowing out. So I'm doing a lot of visualizing here in my mind. All right. But he says, I wear a crew cut quite frequently, and I never have to comb it too much. How have you been, Mrs. Spencer? I said again, only louder, so she hear me. Oh, I've been just fine, Holden. She closed the closet door. How have you been? The way she asked me, I knew right away old Spencer told her I'd been kicked out. All right, so what would that sound like? So she says, oh, I've been fine. How have you been? Right? So she says it in a way that's like, it's you we should be worried about here. Fine, I said. How's Mr. Spencer? He over his gripe yet? Over it, Holden. He's behaving like a perfect, I don't know what. He's in his room, dear. Go right in. All right, so let's do a quick review of this chapter. Then I'll have one more question for you guys. So it says, so chapter 1 review here is Holden's going to tell us about his madman stuff that led to him being in the hospital, right? That's how the book opens. He says, I'm going to tell you this madman stuff. And then he tells us it started the day before Christmas break at his school. He says he lost his team's foils and ruined their fencing match, so he's being ostracized. And he says he climbed to the top of the hill to think about having a goodbye. And then he went to visit Mr. Spencer, his teacher, because he's being kicked out of school. All right, so they're kicking him out of school. We're not entirely sure why, but we know that he had to go have a goodbye by climbing this hill and thinking about stuff. And then he had to go see Mr. Spencer before he left. So you could be ending this chapter thinking about a couple things. One, you could be thinking about the next chapter, what's going to happen here. What's going to happen with Mr. Spencer? So what do you think Mr. Spencer might say to him in this story? You might also think, what do you think is going to happen when he gets kicked out of school? You might go a step further and predicting that. Well, like, what's going to happen when he gets kicked out of school, and where's he going to go? Finally, you might be thinking about, big picture stuff. We're told he ends up in the hospital and he goes through this madman stuff. What do you think this book might be about? Like, what do you think might happen? And try to be as specific as possible in your predictions here, because, we're not looking for, when we're predicting, we're not looking for just like general things like, oh, it's going to be a book about a kid, right? We want to really try to nail down those specific predictions and say, like, here's exactly what I'm picturing in my mind might happen in this story. And you could be totally wrong, and there's no reason for you to be right here. So there's no reason to look it up, or this is not a right or wrong question at all. Really just want to think about what's going on inside your mind here. What exactly are you picturing? What did this chapter set you up for and thinking about? Either in what's going to happen with Mr. Spencer, what's going to happen when he gets kicked out of school, or maybe what's going to happen with this madman stuff that he winds up in the hospital over.